I found the journal 3 weeks after Carolina Wilger disappeared. The police had finished their search, the media had moved on to other stories, and the family had started talking about memorial services. But I kept thinking about the timeline, the gaps that didn't make sense, the way her mobile phone had gone dead right at the worst possible moment. So I drove out to the wheat country east of Brookton, following dirt tracks that most people avoid, looking for answers the official investigation had missed. What I found was a handwritten account tucked inside a grain silo on an abandoned farm. 11 days of survival that never made it into any police report. This is Carolina's story, exactly as she wrote it down. The Utes engine gave one final, rattling cough before dying completely. Carolina Wilger stared at the dashboard as every warning light blinked on in sequence like a Christmas tree, then went dark one by one. The silence that followed felt massive. No engine noise, no radio static, just the endless whisper of wheat stalks brushing against each other in the afternoon wind. She was 40 kilometers from the nearest sealed road, maybe 60 from town. The dirt track stretched ahead and behind her like a thin scar through golden wheat that rolled to every horizon without break. Harvest season meant the properties out here ran skeleton crews, and this particular stretch had been abandoned for years according to the faded signs. She'd taken the shortcut because it saved an hour getting to her cousin's place in Meriden. Now that hour might cost her everything. Carolina turned the key again with deliberate slowness, listening for any sign of life in the engine. Nothing, not even the starter motor's click. "Come on, you bastard." She pumped the accelerator twice, and tried again, holding her breath. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, the temperature needle sat in its normal position, but something fundamental had died in the engine's heart. She grabbed her phone from the passenger seat where it had been charging. No signal bars. Of course not. The nearest tower was probably 30 kilometers away, blocked by the slight rise to her west, where the wheat gave way to scrubland. She'd been meaning to get a satellite phone for trips like this, but harvest season expenses always ate up the spare cash first. The sun hung about 3 hours above the horizon, and the October heat was already brutal even with the windows down. Inside the Utes cabin, the temperature had to be pushing 40 degrees. Carolina rolled down all the windows and climbed out to pop the hood, her boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt. Steam rose from the engine bay in lazy wisps, but not the explosive cloud that meant a blown radiator. She checked the oil dipstick first, clean and at the proper level. Radiator coolant looked normal through the translucent reservoir. The battery terminals were clean and tight, no corrosion or loose connections. But when she traced the main electrical harness with her eyes, following it from the battery toward the alternator, she found the problem. A section of wiring near the back of the engine had melted into a blackened mess, the plastic insulation fused and brittle. Shit. The word came out flat and tired. She'd seen this before on her own property. The cheap aftermarket wiring her dad had installed 5 years ago, finally giving up under heat stress. At home, she could have rewired it in an hour with parts from the workshop. Out here, she had a basic toolkit, some electrical tape, and maybe 10 meters of spare wire in the emergency kit behind her seat. Carolina pulled her toolkit from its storage box and got to work. The melted section was too damaged to splice properly, so she rerouted the main power feed around it, using wire from the trailer connection she didn't need. She stripped the wire ends with her pocket knife, twisting the connections by hand and wrapping them with electrical tape. The work took 90 minutes under the blazing sun. By the end, her shirt was soaked with sweat, her hands were shaking from dehydration, and the metal tools had become almost too hot to touch. She climbed back into the driver's seat, said a quick prayer to whatever gods looked after broken-down vehicles, and turned the key. The starter motor cranked with authority. The engine caught for 3 seconds, coughed, then died. She tried again, pumping the accelerator. Same result, 3 seconds of rough running, then nothing. The bypass wiring was feeding power to the ignition system, but something else had failed when the main harness cooked. Possibly the fuel pump relay. Possibly the engine management computer. Possibly something she couldn't diagnose or fix with the tools available. The sun was getting lower. Maybe 2 hours of good daylight left. Carolina had grown up on a wheat property 60 kilometers south of here, learning machinery repair from her father before she was old enough to see over a workbench. She knew the unwritten rules of the Wheatbelt: stay with your vehicle, conserve water, make yourself visible to aircraft. But those rules assumed someone would miss you within a day or two. Her cousin wasn't expecting her until tomorrow night. Her parents thought she was staying in town for the week to help with harvest preparations. The gap between expectation and reality could stretch to 4 or 5 days before anyone started looking. She had 3 bottles of water in the Utes cooler, maybe 3 liters total, and perhaps 2 days of food if she stretched the snack bars and dried fruit she'd packed for the drive. The nights would drop to 10 degrees, the days would hit 45. Without shelter better than the Utes cabin, she'd be in real trouble by day 3. Carolina climbed onto the Utes roof, using the spare tire as a step, and scanned the wheat fields through her binoculars. The crops stood ready for harvest, the heads heavy and golden, swaying in waves that stretched to every horizon. But, to the southeast, maybe 2 kilometers away, a cluster of farm buildings rose above the wheat, like islands in a golden sea. They looked abandoned from this distance. No vehicles visible, no power lines she could trace, but abandoned meant shelter, and shelter meant survival. She marked the direction carefully with her phone's compass, grabbed 1 water bottle and her broad-brimmed hat, and started walking. The wheat stood chest-high and thick enough that she had to push through it rather than walk around the edges. The seed heads caught on her clothes and worked their way into her boots. After 20 minutes, sweat was running down her back despite the late afternoon hour, and her mouth felt dry, even though she'd been sipping water regularly. The buildings resolved into details as she got closer. A weathered farmhouse with peeling paint and a sagging veranda. A machinery shed with half its corrugated iron roof missing, the remaining sheets flapping in the wind. Behind them both, rising like a concrete monument to better times, stood a grain silo 30 meters tall. The whole place had the empty feeling of somewhere abandoned, not just for seasons, but for years. But the silo looked intact, and intact meant possibility. The farmhouse door hung open on broken hinges. Inside, the floors were thick, with dust and wheat chaff that stirred in small clouds when she walked. Something had been living in the kitchen cupboards, mouse droppings everywhere, and the sharp ammonia smell of old urine. But the walls were solid, the roof leaked in only one corner, and the windows could be secured. It would do for emergency shelter if she needed it. The machinery shed was more promising from a practical standpoint. The collapsed section had taken out most of the floor space, but the far corner still had a good roof and level concrete floor. More importantly, it had a workbench scattered with old tools and a stack of Hessian grain sacks that would make decent bedding with some cleaning. But the silo was the real prize. The access ladder welded to its side was rusty but solid under her weight. The door at the base opened with a screech of protest from hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Inside, the concrete cylinder stretched up into shadows, but the bottom level was dry and surprisingly clean. Best of all, it would stay cool during the day and hold heat at night, natural climate control that could mean the difference between survival and heat stroke. If she was going to be stuck here, the silo was definitely her best option for shelter. Carolina climbed the external ladder to get a better view of her surroundings. From 15 meters up, she could see for kilometers in every direction. Her red ute sat like a toy on the dirt track to the northwest, already seeming impossibly far away. The wheat fields stretched unbroken, except for a few scattered farm buildings on the distant horizons. All too far to walk to in a single day, and all looking as abandoned as this place. But the view also confirmed something that made her stomach tighten with worry. She was completely isolated. No power lines visible anywhere. No roads except the track she'd been following. No sign of recent human activity in any direction. No one would find her by accident, and no one would come looking for at least 3 more days. Her survival depended entirely on what she could accomplish at this abandoned farm. Carolina climbed back down and walked around the buildings, looking for a water source. She found the well behind the house, marked by a concrete collar and a rusted pump housing. But when she removed the access cover and dropped a stone into the shaft, the echo suggested water far below, maybe 30 meters down. The pump head was missing entirely, probably salvaged years ago when the property was abandoned. Without a way to bring water to the surface, the well might as well be on another planet. By the time she walked back to the ute, the sun was touching the horizon, and the temperature was starting its nightly drop. She had maybe 30 minutes before full dark to gather what she needed. Carolina loaded her essential supplies into her backpack with methodical efficiency. The 3 water bottles went in first, then all her food, granola bars, mixed nuts, dried apricots, and a sleeve of crackers, her sleeping bag and camping mat. The first aid kit she always carried. The small solar charger for her phone. The ute's toolkit went in too, along with every piece of wire and electrical component she could strip from the vehicle's non-essential systems. The radio antenna. The cigarette lighter adapter. Wire from the trailer plug she'd already partially cannibalized. If she was going to be stuck here, she needed to bring everything potentially useful to her base camp. The walk back to the silo in fading light was harder than the first trip. The backpack pulled at her shoulders, throwing off her balance as she pushed through the wheat. Twice she lost the rough path she'd beaten down earlier and had to navigate by compass in the growing darkness. But the concrete tower was visible from a kilometer away, a pale landmark against the darkening sky, and she made it to the buildings just as the last light faded from the west. Inside the silo, Carolina spread her sleeping bag on the concrete floor and ate one of her granola bars by phone flashlight. The food tasted like cardboard, but she forced herself to chew slowly and drink only small sips of water. 3 bottles might need to last 3 days, maybe 4. Outside, the wheat rustled constantly in the night breeze, but underneath that sound, she thought she could hear something else. A regular creaking, like machinery with a loose bearing. It was too dark to investigate safely, and she was too tired to care much. Tomorrow she'd explore more thoroughly. Tonight, she just needed to stay warm and conserve energy, but sleep didn't come easily. The silo amplified every sound, her breathing, the settling of the concrete structure, and that persistent creaking from somewhere outside. Twice she thought she heard footsteps in the gravel around the buildings, but when she crept to the door and looked out, she saw only darkness and the pale tops of wheat stalks moving in the wind like ocean waves. When she finally dozed, she dreamed of electrical fires and empty roads that stretched forever through golden fields where nothing moved except the grain itself, bending and whispering secrets she couldn't understand. Carolina woke to her phone's alarm and the immediate realization that the creaking sound had stopped sometime during the night. The silo was completely silent except for her own breathing and the distant whisper of wheat. She climbed outside into the first gray light of dawn and immediately saw what had been making the noise. 20 meters from the silo, an old windmill's metal blades turned slowly in the morning breeze. The blades themselves moved freely, but the pump mechanism below them was seized with rust and corrosion, causing the whole assembly to creak and groan as the blades tried to move the frozen machinery. More importantly, the windmill meant water. If she could get the pump working, she'd solve her biggest survival problem. Carolina ate half a granola bar and drank 3 small sips of water. Her rationing strategy would stretch her supplies to 4 days if she stayed disciplined. Then she walked to the windmill with her toolkit, hope beginning to build in her chest. The pump head was old, but solidly built, probably installed in the 1980s, when this property was still actively farmed. The main shaft moved freely when she worked it by hand, which meant the problem was in the linkage between the windmill blades and the pump mechanism below. That was something she might actually be able to fix. But first, she needed to understand her real situation better. Carolina climbed back up the silo's exterior ladder to the access platform 15 meters above ground. The morning sun was painting the wheat fields gold, and she could see for kilometers in every direction. Her ute was a small red dot on the dirt track to the northwest, looking impossibly distant. The wheat fields stretched unbroken in rolling waves, interrupted only by scattered farm buildings on the far horizons. All too far to walk to in a single day. All looking as abandoned as this place. To the east, she could make out what might be power lines, but they were at least 10 kilometers away across country with no roads. A vehicle moving on the main sealed road would be visible from up here, but the road itself was just a thin line in the distance. The view confirmed her fears completely. She was utterly isolated. No one would find her by accident, and no one would come looking for at least 3 more days. Her survival depended entirely on what she could accomplish at this abandoned farm, with the limited supplies she'd managed to salvage. Back at ground level, Carolina returned to the Outback windmill and started dismantling the pump linkage. The work was frustrating in the extreme, rusted bolts that needed penetrating oil she didn't have. Precision adjustments she had to make by eye and feel. Components worn far beyond their intended service life. But she'd grown up maintaining farm equipment, learning at her father's elbow from the time she could hold a wrench. The principles were the same even if the scale was different. By mid-morning she had the mechanical problems identified. The main drive shaft was bent slightly, probably from years of uneven loading, causing it to bind against its housing. The connecting rod between the windmill head and the pump mechanism was seized with corrosion, where moisture had gotten into the bearing surfaces. Most critically, the leather pump seals had dried and cracked, which meant even if she got the mechanism moving, it might not actually move water efficiently. She could probably fix the binding shaft with careful work and some improvised shims cut from scrap metal. The connecting rod would free up if she could find oil or even cooking grease to work into the joints and give the parts time to loosen. But the pump seals were beyond anything she could repair with her available materials. Still, getting water to the surface was only part of the challenge. She also needed containers to store it, and some way to keep it clean. The farm had a concrete water tank, but when she examined it closely, she found it was cracked along the base and half full of stagnant water that smelled like rotting vegetation. The only containers she'd found were some old paint cans in the machinery shed that would need thorough cleaning before they could hold drinking water. The sun was getting high and hot by the time she'd finished her assessment. Carolina retreated to the silo's cool interior and forced herself to rest during the worst heat of the day. She dozed fitfully on her sleeping bag, waking every few minutes to sounds that might have been important, but turned out to be just wheat stalks rubbing together or the wind moving through the broken machinery shed. When she woke fully, the shadows were pointing east, and her mouth felt like she'd been chewing cotton. She allowed herself 4 careful sips of water, and checked her remaining supplies. 2.5 bottles left. Maybe enough for 3 more days, if she stayed absolutely disciplined. The snack bars and dried fruit might last the same period if she kept her activity level moderate. Outside, the afternoon heat was brutal, but not unbearable in the shade. Carolina went back to work on the windmill, using saliva and elbow grease to free the corroded connecting rod joint by joint. The work was slow and tedious, requiring patience she didn't feel. But by evening she had the mechanism moving freely enough that the windmill's blades could drive the pump shaft up and down in its housing. The real test came when she primed the system with half a bottle of her precious water and worked the pump handle by hand. For the first dozen strokes, nothing happened except the mechanical resistance of the pump fighting against the column of air in the pipe. Then she felt the resistance change as the pump found water deep underground. A few more strokes, and brownish water began trickling from the outlet pipe. The flow was slow, and the water looked terrible. But it was water. If she could let it run clear, and find a way to filter out the worst sediment, she might have solved her survival problem. But as she stood there watching the thin stream of brownish water, Carolina became aware of something that made her skin crawl with primitive unease. The wheat around the farm buildings was moving in patterns that didn't match the evening wind. Stalks were bending and springing back in rough lines that suggested something large moving through the crop, circling the buildings just outside the cleared area. She grabbed her toolkit and backed toward the silo, watching the wheat carefully. The movement stopped when she moved, started again when she stood still. Something was definitely out there, pacing back and forth at the edge of visibility, staying just far enough away to avoid clear observation. Carolina spent that night inside the silo, with the door barricaded shut using grain sacks and a length of pipe she'd found in the machinery shed. She listened to sounds she couldn't identify, and tried to convince herself that wild dogs or even feral pigs could explain the movement patterns she'd observed. But deep down, she was starting to suspect her isolation might not be as complete as she'd thought, and she wasn't sure if that was good news or the worst possible development. The water pump continued its slow trickle outside, gradually filling the paint can she'd positioned under the outlet. By morning, if she lived long enough to see it, she'd have water. The question was whether she'd live long enough to drink it. Carolina woke to the sound of the pump still working, and the immediate relief of knowing she'd survived another night. The paint can had overflowed during the hours of darkness, creating a small muddy patch that looked like heaven to her. She drank deeply from the clearest water she could collect, not caring about the metallic taste or the fine sediment that settled at the bottom of her makeshift cup. Her body needed hydration more than her taste buds minded the flavor. The wheat around the building stood still in the morning calm, showing no sign of whatever had been moving through it the night before. Carolina told herself she'd imagined the whole thing, a product of stress and isolation, and the strange acoustics of wind moving through grain. But she kept the largest wrench from her toolkit in her hand as she ventured toward the edge of the cleared area. The wheat grew in neat rows that stretched beyond sight in every direction, planted with mechanical precision sometime earlier in the year. Up close, she could see it was ready for harvest, heavy heads drooping with grain, stalks dry and golden brown. Someone should have been out here weeks ago with a header, collecting all this valuable grain. Instead, it was going to waste, standing in the field like an abandoned fortune. She pushed into the first row, following it away from the buildings. The wheat closed around her like a tunnel, blocking her view of everything except the narrow path between stalks. Within 50 meters she'd lost sight of the silo completely. The silence felt different here, muffled and oppressive, broken only by the whisper of grain brushing against her clothing. Carolina had walked maybe 200 meters when she found the first sign that someone else had been here recently. A section of wheat had been flattened in a rough circle, stalks bent but not broken. In the center of the circle sat an empty plastic water bottle and the cold remains of a small fire. Her heart started beating faster as she knelt to examine the evidence. The water bottle was clean, no sun damage or dirt stains that would indicate long exposure. The ashes in the improvised fire pit were gray rather than black, but they hadn't been scattered by wind. This camp was days old at most, maybe a week. She picked up the water bottle and turned it over in her hands, looking for any identifying marks. No label, but the plastic had those distinctive ridges that meant it came from a multi-pack purchased at a supermarket. Someone had been out here drinking bottled water while she was dying of thirst 20 minutes walk away. Carolina pushed deeper into the wheat, following what looked like a faint path beaten down by repeated passage. The stalks were bent, rather than broken, suggesting someone who moved carefully through the crop, without wanting to leave obvious signs. She found 2 more camping spots in the next hour of searching. One had a torn piece of flannel shirt caught on the wheat stalks, faded blue fabric that looked recently snagged. The other had tire tracks pressed into the bare earth between rows, 4-wheel drive tracks that looked fresh enough to have been made within the past week. Someone with a working vehicle had been driving through these wheat fields recently. Someone who was camping rough, instead of using the perfectly good buildings. That made no sense unless they were hiding from something. Or someone. The thought hit her like a physical blow. What if whoever was out here didn't want to be found? What if they'd seen her struggling with the pump and the windmill, and decided to stay hidden rather than offer help. People hiding in wheat fields weren't usually up to anything good. Carolina turned around and started walking fast back toward the silo, her mind racing through increasingly dark possibilities. The wheat seemed thicker now, the rows harder to follow. She kept thinking she heard footsteps matching her pace, but when she stopped to listen, everything went quiet except for her own breathing and the rustle of grain in the morning breeze. She made it back to the buildings, breathing hard and sweating despite the relatively cool temperature. The silo looked different now, not like shelter, but like a potential trap. If someone wanted to corner her, all they had to do was wait until she went inside, then block the single door. But she needed water, and the pump was still trickling steadily into her improvised collection system. Carolina filled every bottle and container she could find, working fast and checking the wheat line every few seconds. Nothing moved out there that she could see, but she could feel the weight of observation, eyes watching her from somewhere just beyond the cleared area. When she had enough water stored for several days, Carolina made a decision that surprised her. Instead of hiding in the silo, she climbed the rusty ladder welded to its side and pulled herself onto the domed concrete roof. The view from up there changed everything. She could see for kilometers in every direction, and the wheat fields weren't as empty as they'd appeared from ground level. There were paths cut through the grain in a rough grid pattern, like someone had been driving back and forth systematically over a period of days or weeks. In 3 different spots, she could make out the dark squares of camps like the ones she'd found. But what made her stomach drop with genuine fear was the sight of a vehicle parked about a kilometer away, hidden in a stand of dead trees she hadn't noticed from ground level. It looked like a white pickup truck, and it was pointed directly toward the farm buildings. Carolina climbed down from the silo roof with her hands shaking. Someone was definitely out there, and they'd been watching her struggle for days without offering help. That meant they either couldn't help or didn't want to help. Neither option was good news for her survival. She spent the rest of the day inside the silo, but not hiding or resting. Instead, she went through every corner of the building systematically, looking for anything the previous occupants might have left behind. She'd been focused on shelter and basic supplies before. Now she was looking for answers, for clues about what had happened here and why someone would be watching her. The silo was bigger than she'd initially realized, with storage areas built into the thick concrete walls and a partial second floor she'd missed in the darkness of her first night. Most of the space was empty except for dust and the scattered detritus of abandonment. But in a corner of the upper level, hidden behind some old grain sacks that had probably been there for years, Carolina found a plastic storage box that made her heart race with equal parts hope and fear. Inside were things that didn't belong in an abandoned farm building: a 2-way radio with a broken antenna that could be repaired, a detailed topographical map of the local area, marked with red X's at a dozen different locations, a notebook full of handwritten entries in different handwriting, different pens, different dates, and underneath everything, wrapped in an oily cloth, a small revolver with a box of ammunition. Carolina's hands were shaking as she opened the notebook and started reading. The entries were dated, starting from 2 years ago, and continuing sporadically through to 3 months past. Different people, different handwriting styles, all writing about being stranded in the wheat fields around these buildings, all mentioning the white pickup truck. All getting increasingly paranoid and frightened as days passed. The last entry was dated 3 months ago, written in a woman's careful script. Day 6. He's getting closer. Found tire tracks right up to the buildings this morning. Sarah thinks we should try to run for it tonight, but the truck is faster than us on foot. If someone finds this and we're not here anymore, check the old well behind the machinery shed. Whatever happens, don't trust the radio. He listens to everything. Carolina felt physically sick as the implications sank in. She wasn't the first person to get stranded here, and the others hadn't just been rescued and forgotten to clean up their belongings. They'd been running from whoever was in that white truck, And now she was alone with the same threat. She checked the radio next, her hand still trembling. The battery compartment was corroded, but she had spare batteries in her toolkit. It took 20 minutes of careful work to clean the contacts and get power flowing to the circuits. When she finally got it working, static filled the air, broken by occasional voices too distant to understand clearly. She tried calling for help on the emergency frequency, identifying herself and her location. No response except more static. Then she tried the local repeater frequency, and a man's voice came through clearly. "Well, hello there, Carolina. I was wondering when you'd find that radio." Her blood went cold. The voice was friendly, almost cheerful, with the casual tone of someone greeting a neighbor. But he knew her name. He'd been listening, probably watching her for days. "Who is this?" she managed to say, her voice cracking despite her efforts to sound calm. "Just a neighbor, Carolina. I've been meaning to come introduce myself, but you seemed so busy with that old pump. Nice work getting it running, by the way. Takes real skill to coax water out of those old windmills." Carolina's mouth was completely dry despite all the water she'd been drinking. "Why didn't you help me fix it? Why didn't you offer assistance?" "I will help you, Carolina, soon as we get a few things sorted out. See, this is private property, and technically you're trespassing. But I'm not unreasonable. We can work something out that benefits everyone." The way he said "work something out" made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. There was something wrong with the whole situation, something predatory, in the casual friendliness of his voice. Carolina turned off the radio without responding, but she could feel him out there somewhere, watching and waiting. That night, she didn't even try to sleep. She sat in the dark with a revolver in her lap and the radio beside her, listening for engines or footsteps or any sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of wind through wheat. Around midnight, she heard the truck start up somewhere out in the grain fields. The engine noise moved around the farm in a slow circle, never getting close enough for her to see headlights, but close enough to let her know he was there. Close enough to let her know he could come closer anytime he wanted. By dawn, Carolina was exhausted and terrified, but she was also angry. She'd survived 4 days on her own, fixed the water pump, and found supplies to extend her survival indefinitely. She wasn't going to be terrorized by some creep with a truck and a radio. The anger carried her through the morning as she made plans. She had water now, and food for several more days if she rationed carefully. The radio worked, which meant she could call for real help if she could figure out how to do it without him listening. And she had a gun, even though she'd never fired one in her life. What she didn't have was a way out on her own terms. Her ute was still dead, and running across open wheat fields toward the distant road would just make her an easy target for someone in a truck. But she also couldn't stay here indefinitely, waiting for him to make his move. Around noon, the weather started changing in a way that added new urgency to her situation. The morning had been clear and hot, but clouds were building in the west, moving fast and looking dark. Carolina had grown up in wheat country, and she knew what those clouds meant. A storm was coming, and it was going to be severe. The first drops of rain started falling, just as she heard the truck engine again, closer this time. She climbed the silo ladder and looked out toward the trees, where she'd seen it parked. The white pickup was moving, driving slowly through the wheat directly toward the farm buildings. Carolina climbed down and grabbed the radio. "What do you want?" she called, not bothering with radio protocol. "Just to talk, Carolina. Storm's coming, and I figured you might want some real shelter. That old silo's going to be pretty miserable when the wind picks up." She could see the truck now, maybe 500 meters away and closing steadily. There was one person in the cab, but she couldn't make out any details through the wheat stalks and the growing rain. "I'm fine where I am," she radioed back. "Are you though? Because I've been watching you for days, Carolina, and you don't look fine. You look scared, and tired, and way out of your depth. But I can help with all that." The truck stopped just outside the cleared area around the buildings. Carolina could see it clearly now through the intensifying rain. White pickup, maybe 10 years old, with extra lights mounted on the roof and a heavy-duty bumper designed for rough country work. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there with the engine running while the storm built overhead and lightning began flashing in the distance. Carolina was trapped between the approaching storm and whatever intentions the man in the truck had for her. She had maybe an hour before the weather became dangerous, and she had to make a choice. Stay in the silo and hope it held together through whatever was coming, or trust the man with the cheerful voice who knew her name and had been stalking her for days. The radio crackled with his voice again. "Clock's ticking, Carolina, what's it going to be?" Thunder rolled across the wheat fields like the sound of approaching war, and Carolina realized that her real test was just beginning. The rain hammered down harder, and Carolina made her choice. She couldn't trust someone who'd been watching her suffer for days without showing himself until now. Whatever was in that truck, it wasn't rescue. "I'm staying put," she radioed back, trying to keep her voice steady. A laugh came through the static, genuinely amused. "Your funeral, Carolina. Literally, maybe. That silo's seen better days, and this storm's gonna be a monster. But hey, your choice." The truck sat there for another long minute, engine running, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. Then it backed up slowly and disappeared into the wheat, leaving only tire tracks in the mud to prove it had been there. Carolina climbed back up the silo ladder to watch it go. She could see the white shape moving through the grain, getting smaller but not leaving the area entirely, just pulling back to a safe distance to wait out the storm. The weather hit like a freight train 20 minutes later. Wind howled around the concrete silo, making the metal access ladder sing and vibrate. Rain came in sideways through gaps in the structure, soaking everything despite her efforts to seal the openings with grain sacks. Carolina huddled in the driest corner with her supplies, listening to the building groan and shake under the assault. But the silo held together, just as it had been designed to do. The thick concrete walls absorbed the worst of the wind, and the cylindrical shape shed the rain efficiently. More importantly, she was finally getting clear radio reception as the storm passed overhead. The atmospheric conditions were amplifying signals from across the region. "This is Carolina Wilga," she transmitted when there was a break in the emergency chatter flooding the airwaves. "I'm stranded east of the Brookton Road. My vehicle broke down and I need assistance." Silence for a moment, then a woman's voice. "Carolina, Jesus, we've been looking everywhere for you. This is Sarah Chen, with the Regional Emergency Services. Where exactly are you?" Carolina's heart jumped, with the first real hope she'd felt in days. "I'm at some old farm buildings, maybe 20 kilometers east of where the dirt road curves north, past the railway crossing. There's a concrete silo here. Can you see any other landmarks, power lines, distinctive hills, anything that might help us pinpoint your location? Just wheat fields in every direction. But there's someone else out here who's been watching me. White pickup truck. I think he's been jamming radio communications somehow." Static filled the radio for a long moment. When Sarah came back, her voice was different, more careful, more professional. "Carolina, can you describe this person? Have you seen him clearly?" "No, but he knows my name. He's got a radio on the same frequencies. He was here during the storm but pulled back when I wouldn't go with him." "Don't trust him," Sarah said immediately. "Whatever he says, whatever he promises, don't go with him. We're going to triangulate your signal and get help to you, but it might take time. The storms hit the whole region." "How long?" Carolina asked, but the connection was already breaking up. She tried to raise Sarah again, got nothing but static and the distant voices of emergency workers dealing with storm damage across the Wheatbelt. At least now someone official knew where she was, approximately. The storm raged through the rest of the day, and all that night. Carolina dozed fitfully, waking every time the wind shifted or debris banged against the silo walls. But when dawn came gray and wet, she was still alive, and the structure was still intact. She climbed outside to assess the damage and nearly jumped out of her skin. Fresh tire tracks circled the buildings in the mud, deep ruts that definitely hadn't been there before the storm. He'd come back during the worst of the weather, driven around and around the silo while she was trapped inside, unable to hear his engine over the wind and rain. The thought made her physically sick. How long had he been out there? What had he been planning while she was helpless and unaware? Carolina tried the radio again, working through different frequencies. She picked up scattered voices, farmers checking on storm damage, transport drivers reporting road conditions, but she couldn't raise Sarah or any other emergency services. By afternoon, her water was running low again, despite the storm's refill of her collection containers. The fresh tire tracks had her too nervous to venture far from the silo, but she needed to maintain her survival preparations. That's when she found the second note. This one was tucked under a rock near the windmill, protected from the rain by a piece of plastic. Simple paper, neat handwriting. Sarah's not coming, Carolina. Emergency services are swamped with real emergencies. When you're ready to be reasonable, use Channel 12. You can't hide in there forever. A friend. Carolina stared at the paper with shaking hands. He'd been close enough to leave this while she was sleeping through the storm's noise. Could have done anything to her while she was vulnerable. The violation of her small sphere of safety made her want to scream. She switched the radio to Channel 12 but didn't transmit immediately. Almost at once, that cheerful voice came through. "Found my second note, did you?" Carolina grabbed the microphone, anger overcoming caution. "What do you want from me?" "Just to help, like I keep telling you. You're in real trouble out here, Carolina. That emergency services lady you talked to yesterday, she's not coming. They're all dealing with the storm damage and you're not exactly a high priority." "You're lying." "Am I? When's the last time you saw a search plane? Heard a helicopter? It's been 6 days, Carolina. If they were really looking hard, they'd have found you by now." The words hit harder because she'd been thinking exactly the same thing. 6 days was a long time to be missing. Long enough for search efforts to be scaled back, especially with storm damage across the region requiring immediate attention. Even if that's true, why do you care? Why not just leave me alone? Let's just say I have reasons to help people who get stuck out here. This place has a history, Carolina. These buildings, this whole area, it's a trap. People get stranded here more often than you'd think. What kind of trap? The kind that makes vehicles break down right when people need them most. The kind that interferes with radio signals until it's almost too late. You're not the first person to spend desperate days in that silo, and you won't be the last unless you let me help. Carolina felt cold despite the afternoon warmth. "You're saying this place is cursed or something?" "I'm saying there are people who benefit when travelers disappear in remote areas. People who don't want certain routes becoming too popular or well-traveled. Your breakdown wasn't an accident, Carolina." The radio went quiet, leaving her staring at it with growing horror. The man's words made a terrible kind of sense. Her ute had been running perfectly, until it suddenly wasn't. The electrical failure had been complete and immediate, not the gradual degradation she'd expect from normal component wear. The radio problems, the isolation, the way this place felt, deliberately forgotten despite being relatively close to traveled roads. "If that's true," she transmitted carefully, "how do I know you're not part of it? Because if I wanted you gone, you'd already be gone. I've had plenty of opportunities. What I want is for you to trust me long enough to get you away from this trap. And then what happens? Then you go home and forget this place exists. Simple as that." Carolina looked around at the buildings that had been her prison for almost a week, at the tire tracks circling her shelter like predator marks, at the vast wheat fields that seemed designed to swallow people without a trace. "Meet me halfway," the voice continued. "There's an old windmill about a kilometer north of your silo. You can see it from the top of your access ladder. Be there at sunset, and I'll prove I'm trying to help you." Carolina climbed up and looked in the direction he'd indicated. Sure enough, there was another windmill visible above the wheat, its blades turning slowly in the afternoon breeze. She'd noticed it before but never thought to investigate. "What's there?" she asked. "Answers. And supplies. Real water storage, not the makeshift system you've been using. Plus some things that belong to the last person who got trapped here." "What happened to them?" Silence stretched across the radio waves for a long moment. Finally, They trusted the wrong people. Don't make the same mistake, Carolina. Sunset at the Windmill. Come alone, and bring that gun you found. The frequency went dead. Carolina tried to raise him again. Got nothing but static. She was left with a choice that felt like choosing between different kinds of death. Stay in a silo and hope real rescue would eventually come, or trust a man who'd been stalking her to lead her even deeper into the wilderness. But he was right about one thing that chilled her to the bone. No planes had come looking, no helicopters. Even the emergency services contact had vanished after one brief conversation. Either the storm had knocked out communications completely, or no one was really looking for her anymore. Carolina spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for what might be her last gamble. She packed water, the remaining food, and the revolver she'd found in the storage box. If this was a trap, at least she wouldn't go quietly. If it wasn't, maybe she'd finally get some real answers about what had happened to her and why. The Windmill looked different up close than it had from the silo. Newer construction, with a concrete foundation that showed recent maintenance. A pump house sat beside it, and Carolina could hear the sound of water moving through pipes. A working system, not the jury-rigged setup she'd been surviving on. "You came," said a voice behind her. Carolina spun around, the revolver steady in her hands despite her racing heart. The man standing at the edge of the wheat looked utterly ordinary. Middle-aged, wearing clean work clothes and a broad-brimmed hat. He could have been any farmer in the district, the kind of person she'd grown up around. "Easy there," he said, hands visible and empty. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then what are you here for?" "To show you this." He gestured toward the pump house without moving any closer. "Take a look inside, Carolina, but keep that gun ready. You're going to need it for what comes next." Carolina approached the small building carefully, keeping the weapon trained on him. The pump house door was unlocked. Inside, she found something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Personal belongings arranged on metal shelves like a macabre museum. Wallets and purses, their contents laid out neatly, mobile phones in various states of damage, car keys attached to keychains that told stories of interrupted lives, jewelry and watches that caught the late sunlight streaming through a small window. And photographs. Dozens of photographs showing the silo, the farm buildings and people. Different people at different times over what looked like several years, all looking desperate and frightened, all clearly trapped and struggling to survive. "Jesus Christ," Carolina whispered, lowering the gun involuntarily. "The last 5 years, worth," the man said quietly from the doorway. "Travelers who got lost on the back roads around here, people whose vehicles mysteriously broke down near those buildings. Some of them made it out alive, others didn't. Why are you showing me this?" "Because I helped put some of those things there." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, carrying the weight of confession. "And because I'm tired of it. There's a group that runs this operation, Carolina. They target specific people, strand them in remote locations, and then make them an offer they can't refuse." Carolina backed toward the door, the revolver rising again. "What kind of offer?" "Join us, or disappear permanently. People with useful skills get recruited. Mechanics, electronics technicians, anyone who can maintain equipment in remote locations. Someone like you would be very valuable to the right kind of organization." "What organization?" "The kind that moves things across borders, without official paperwork. The kind that needs reliable people who can keep trucks running, and communications equipment working in places where help is never coming." Carolina felt sick as the implications became clear, and if people refuse, then they become part of the missing persons statistics. Another tragic case of someone getting lost in the remote areas of the Wheatbelt. "So why are you warning me? Why not just let it happen like you did with the others?" The man's face changed, showing something that might have been genuine remorse. Because I have a daughter about your age. And because some lines shouldn't be crossed, even by people like me. He stepped closer, and Carolina tightened her grip on the revolver. I can get you out of here tonight, but we have to move now. The others will be back to check on you soon, and when they find out I've told you the truth. He shrugged, the gesture somehow more ominous than any threat could have been. What others? The ones who've been running this operation for years. They'll be coming to make you the offer soon, probably tonight. And when they realize I've burned my cover to warn you, neither of us will be walking away from this place. Carolina looked back at the shelves of personal belongings, at the photographs of desperate people who'd faced the same choice she was facing now. Her mind raced through everything that had happened over the past week. The convenient breakdown that had seemed so random. The failed communications despite clear weather. The feeling of being watched and hunted. How do I know this isn't part of it, another test or manipulation? Because I'm about to burn all my bridges. The man pulled out a radio and switched it to a frequency she recognized. This is Walker. The target knows everything. I'm getting her out. Angry voices erupted from the speaker immediately. Threats, curses, demands that he bring Carolina back to the silo for processing. References to schedules and quotas that made her skin crawl. That's how you know, Walker said, switching off the radio. Now we run, or we both end up as part of their operation. Permanently, Carolina stared at him, trying to process the enormity of what he was telling her. A criminal organization that deliberately stranded travelers. That recruited or eliminated people based on their usefulness. That had been operating in the Wheatbelt for years without detection. How many people? She asked. Too many. Your name came up 3 weeks ago, when someone ran your license plate through their system. Mechanic, electronics experience, lives alone, minimal family connections. Perfect recruitment profile. The casual way he said it made her feel like prey that had been stalked and studied. The breakdown was deliberate, remote-controlled electromagnetic pulse device. Fries vehicle electrical systems from a distance. Looks like natural component failure. We've been using them for 2 years. Carolina felt a surge of rage at the violation, at being manipulated and terrorized for someone else's criminal purposes. But the anger also brought clarity. She could trust Walker or not, but staying here meant facing whatever the others had planned for her. And based on the photographs in the pump house, that probably didn't end well for people who refused to cooperate. What's your plan? She asked. My truck is hidden about 2 kilometers from here. We get there, drive to the nearest police station, and I turn myself in while you tell them everything. The operation gets shut down, and you go home. What happens to you? Prison probably, but that's better than what happens if we stay here. Lightning flashed in the distance, and Carolina realized another storm was building. The weather would provide cover for their movement, but it would also make the journey more dangerous. We go now, she said, making her decision. They left the pump house and its grisly museum behind, striking out across the wheat fields under a darkening sky. Walker led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the area well. Carolina followed, the revolver in her hand and her mind racing through everything she'd learned. The wheat closed around them as they pushed deeper into the grain, leaving the farm buildings behind. Somewhere ahead lay Walker's truck and the possibility of escape. Somewhere behind them, other members of the criminal organization were probably discovering that their latest recruitment target had slipped away. The race was on. 3 months after that night, I watched Carolina Wilger stand at her kitchen sink while the morning sun painted the wheat fields beyond her property line. The coffee was hot in her hands, steam rising in lazy spirals, but I could see her fingers still trembled slightly. They did that now, especially in the mornings, when the light was similar to what she'd seen during those 11 days. The doctors had called it residual stress response, normal after surviving what she'd been through. The newspapers had called it a miracle survival story when the sanitized version was finally released. 11 days lost in the Wheatbelt after a vehicle breakdown, rescued when a reformed criminal led her to safety and helped expose a major trafficking operation. That was the official version anyway, carefully edited to protect ongoing investigations. The real story was more complex, darker in some ways but also more hopeful. Carolina had survived not just through individual toughness, but because one person in a criminal organization had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. Her phone buzzed on the counter, displaying a text from an unknown number. "Weather looks good for harvest this year. Hope you're doing well. -W2. She deleted it without responding, like she had with the dozen others Walker had sent over the past months. He checked in occasionally from the minimum security facility, where he was serving his sentence, never pushing for contact, just making sure she was alive and coping with what they'd been through together. The criminal investigation had concluded 2 weeks earlier, with 5 arrests, including the man who'd been running the trafficking operation from what appeared to be a legitimate freight company in Perth. The abandoned farm property had been seized as evidence, the personal belongings returned to families who'd been waiting years for answers about missing relatives. Carolina had testified in closed session, her identity protected throughout the legal proceedings. The prosecutor had been satisfied with her account, though she could tell he suspected there were details she hadn't shared. There always were, in cases involving organized crime and remote area disappearances. She hadn't told anyone about the moment of choice she'd faced in the pump house. Trust a man who admitted to being part of the organization that had targeted her, or stay and face whatever the others had planned. In the end, it hadn't been about trust at all. It had been about recognizing that people could change, that even someone who'd done wrong things could still choose to do right when lives were at stake. They'd made it to Walker's truck just as headlights appeared on the track leading to the farm buildings. No dramatic chase scene, no gunfire in the wheat fields. Just a quiet drive through the night to a police station in Meriden, where Walker had surrendered himself, and Carolina had begun telling the first of many careful versions of what had happened. The phone rang, startling her from the memory, her sister Sarah's name on the display. "Morning, just checking how you're feeling about today." Carolina looked at the calendar on her refrigerator. October 15th. Exactly 3 months since her ute had died on that remote track. She'd circled the date in red ink without really thinking about why it mattered. "I'm okay. Better than I expected, actually." "You sure? I can drive out if you want company for the anniversary." "No, I'm good, really." And she was, mostly. The nightmares had faded to maybe once a week. The hypervigilance when driving alone had settled into simple caution and better emergency preparedness. She was healing, even if the process wasn't always linear. "The insurance company finalized everything yesterday," Sarah said. "The settlement should be in your account by close of business. Thanks for handling all the paperwork." Carolina had asked her sister to deal with the insurance claim rather than face the endless questions about the breakdown, the damage to her vehicle, and the circumstances of her rescue. "What are you thinking of doing with the money?" Carolina had been considering that question for weeks. The settlement was substantial enough to buy a reliable replacement vehicle and still have money left over for workshop improvements or business expansion. All practical choices that made financial sense. "I'm thinking about establishing a scholarship program," she said. "A scholarship?" "For young people from remote areas who want to study mechanical trades. Help them get the skills they need to maintain essential equipment in isolated communities." She paused, watching a crow land on her fence post. "People out there depend on their equipment working properly. When it fails, they're vulnerable in ways most people living in towns can't imagine." Sarah was quiet for a moment, absorbing the idea. "That's really meaningful, Carolina. Dad would have loved that concept." Their father had run the regional agricultural equipment repair service until his death 5 years earlier. Carolina had inherited his workshop and much of his technical knowledge, But more importantly, she'd inherited his understanding of how mechanical failures could cascade into life-threatening situations for people living far from help. I'll need to research how to set it up properly, talk to the trade schools, figure out selection criteria, handle all the legal requirements. I can help with the legal side. Pro bono sister rates. Carolina smiled, feeling something like optimism for the first time in months. Sarah's law practice had grown steadily, and she'd developed expertise in non-profit organizations and educational foundations. I might take you up on that. After ending the call, Carolina walked outside to her workshop. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the dusty scent of ripening wheat from neighboring properties. Harvest season was starting, which meant she'd be busy with the inevitable equipment breakdowns and emergency repairs that came with intensive agricultural operations. She unlocked the workshop doors and surveyed her organized domain. Tools arranged on pegboards, parts bins labeled and sorted, workbenches cleared and ready for whatever problems people brought her. This space had been her sanctuary before the ordeal, and it was becoming that again. But something had fundamentally changed in how she approached her work. She found herself paying more attention to the stories behind the broken equipment. The farmer who'd been running his header on borrowed time because he couldn't afford major repairs before harvest. The transport driver whose truck had limped in on its last functioning injector, hours from breakdown on a remote highway. The isolation and vulnerability that mechanical failure represented for people who lived and worked far from assistance. She'd started keeping a notebook documenting these situations, not for any specific purpose initially, just to remember the human element behind the technical problems. The scholarship idea had grown from those observations. If she could help even a few young people develop the skills to keep essential machinery running in remote communities, it might prevent someone else from facing the kind of desperate situation she'd survived. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Tom Richardson, a local farmer whose header she'd completely rebuilt earlier in the year. Carolina? Sorry to call so early, but I've got a problem. The GPS guidance system is acting up, and I need to start cutting today if the weather holds. What kind of symptoms? Display screen keeps freezing, then reboots itself. Sometimes the steering correction just stops working mid-row. Nearly put me into the fence twice yesterday. Carolina grabbed her tool bag and keys to the replacement ute she'd purchased the previous week. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Tom's property took her past several roads that led deeper into the Wheatbelt, remote tracks that disappeared into the vast agricultural landscape, some well-maintained, others barely passable. She'd traveled dozens of similar roads over the years, usually without giving them much thought. Now she noticed them differently. Potential isolation points, communication dead zones, places where help might be hours or days away if something went wrong. She didn't let the awareness paralyze her work. She still took the emergency calls, still drove out to isolated properties to fix essential equipment when farmers were desperate. But she carried better emergency supplies now. Multiple communication devices including a satellite beacon. More water and food than any single job should require. Simple preparations that felt like reasonable precautions rather than fearful overreactions. Tom's header was parked beside his machinery shed, a massive piece of equipment worth more than most people's houses. During peak harvest, it would run nearly 24 hours a day, cutting and processing wheat with mechanical precision. When it worked properly, started acting up yesterday evening, Tom explained as they climbed into the air-conditioned cab. Figured it might sort itself out overnight, but it's worse this morning. Carolina powered up the guidance system and watched the initialization sequence carefully. The display flickered twice during startup, then showed normal operating parameters. Walk me through exactly what happens when you engage the automatic steering. They ran through the system diagnostics together, Carolina following the logical troubleshooting sequence her father had taught her years ago. Start with the obvious problems. Work systematically through the possibilities. Don't make assumptions about what's causing the issue. 20 minutes later, she traced the problem to a loose connection in the wiring harness behind the main display unit. A simple fix that would have been easy to miss without methodical testing. How'd you know to check there? Tom asked, as she tightened the connection with a specialized tool. Process of elimination. When you get intermittent problems like this, it's usually a connection issue rather than component failure. Just had to find which connection was causing trouble. My son keeps telling me I should learn more about these electronic systems. Says the farmers who can't troubleshoot their own equipment are going to get left behind by technology. Carolina thought about her developing scholarship program. He's probably right. These control systems get more complex every year. Problem is, there's nowhere around here to learn about them properly. The technical college is 3 hours away, and most of their courses are designed for city mechanics, not agricultural equipment specialists. That might change in the future, Carolina said carefully. There's growing recognition that rural communities need specialized technical training programs. She didn't elaborate on her plans, but the conversation reinforced her conviction about the scholarship idea. Young people in remote communities needed access to training that matched their local employment opportunities, equipment repair and maintenance skills that would let them build careers while staying close to home and family. The header's guidance system completed its calibration routine successfully, all functions operating within normal parameters. Tom wrote her a check for the service call and thanked her for the quick response time. "You know," he said as she packed up her tools, "I've been thinking about what happened to you out there 3 months ago." Carolina went still, her hands freezing on the toolbox latches. Most people in the district knew the basic story: vehicle breakdown, days stranded, eventual rescue, but few brought it up directly. "Takes a lot of skill and determination to survive something like that on your own," Tom continued. "But I guess growing up around here learning to fix things and solve problems, that probably gave you advantages most people wouldn't have." "It did help," she said quietly, "more than I realized at the time. Makes you think about how important it is for people to have practical skills, self-reliance, especially out here where professional help isn't always readily available." Carolina nodded, recognizing the truth in his observation. Her survival had depended not just on mechanical knowledge, but on the broader problem-solving mindset that came with growing up in an environment where fixing things yourself was often the only viable option. The drive home took her past the turnoff to the track where her ordeal had begun. She slowed the ute, considering the side road that disappeared into wheat fields, then continued toward home without stopping. She wasn't ready for that particular pilgrimage yet, might never be, but the fact that she could look at the road without experiencing panic felt like genuine progress. Back at her workshop, she sat down with her notebook and wrote about Tom's header repair, his concerns about keeping pace with advancing technology, his son's observations about farmers needing electronic troubleshooting skills. Another data point in her growing understanding of what rural communities needed to remain viable. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but not Walker this time. A farmer 2 districts over, referred by someone she'd helped the previous month. Hydraulic system problems with a large seeder needed someone who could work on the computerized control systems. She replied to arrange a service time, then added his situation to her notebook. The pattern was becoming clear. Demand for specialized technical skills in remote areas far exceeded the local supply of qualified technicians. The scholarship program was evolving from a vague idea into a concrete plan, with real potential to help people. As the sun climbed higher, Carolina felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about the future. Not just getting back to her previous normal routine, but building something better and more meaningful than what had existed before. Her ordeal in the Wheatbelt had revealed vulnerabilities and dangers she'd never imagined, but it had also clarified her understanding of human resilience and community interdependence. People survived not just through individual strength, but through the skills and knowledge that connected them to their communities and environments. She could help create and strengthen those connections. The scholarship program, her continued work as a specialized mechanic, her growing network of relationships with farmers and transport operators across the region, All of it contributed to the web of practical knowledge that kept rural communities functioning. The sun was fully up now, promising another warm day as harvest season moved into full swing. Carolina locked up her workshop and headed inside to start researching scholarship programs and nonprofit organizational structures in earnest. She had important work to do, and for the first time since her rescue, she felt truly ready to begin. If you've ever driven those long dirt roads through the Wheatbelt, you know how the silence can get inside your head. How easy it would be to disappear out there, to become just another unsolved case in a landscape too big for all its secrets. Hit like and subscribe. There are more stories like Carolina's, and some of them are still waiting to be told.